actually the farthest on the right from the center. That doesn't necessarily should be taken as a contribution to the rightest of views, in both senses. But what I'll try to do is to just substantiate some of the issues which have come from both of my colleagues till now, and I think both of them have raised very important aspects of the discussion that we have today. Now, when we talk about Europe and Asia and recession, crisis, all these things, these are all very negative and gloomy terms. The point is that, is it necessary in the first place to subscribe to such gloom? Now, as a student of the regional architecture, what I cannot ever help or avoid thinking is that Asia is actually a very good place to discuss the troubles of Europe, because Asia suffered from a financial crisis less than 15 years ago. Now, that crisis in a number of ways was actually more than a financial crisis. It became a social crisis in certain countries, it erupted as a political crisis. But it also became a great lesson in learning and experience. Let's look at some of the causalities. When Asia suffered in 1997, Europe didn't. When Asia suffered and for 3 to 4 years it went into a prolonged economic contraction, Europe didn't. This time when Europe suffered, Asia has gone into contraction. Now, what does this mean? First, it puts to a complete end the whole notion of decoupling. There's nothing called decoupling anymore. Asia depends on Europe for economic sustenance. Why? Because Asia is a producer for Europe. And what it produces for Europe is eventually consumed by Europe, and that in turn fuels consumption in Asia. So to that extent, this equation can change only if Asia by itself becomes a cycle of production and consumption. Or on the other hand, there are other regions that come up which run into this similar cycle of production and consumption. So I don't really think it is in a sense, at this point in time, rational for Asia to say that Europe is gone and over. Europe, even a dying Europe, will create troubles for Asia as it is. Now, having said that, what's wrong with Europe? My colleagues pointed out the basics that are wrong. Now, I think the problem with a situation like the one that we are seeing in Europe is that we use the word crisis too lightly, too frequently, much as we use the word great as an objective. What Europe is going through is actually a prolonged economic downturn. Now, there are points in time in the economic histories of nations, countries in the world when cycles last much longer than they are expected. And this holds true for both booms and busts. I'm not saying this is a boom and bust scenario. What we are simply getting to see is that there is a prolongation of economic downturn where, as a collective of 27 countries, or more specifically as a Eurozone entity, the zone is unable to record the kind of economic performance and register the kind of economic activity that is expected out of it given its economic size. Now, having said that, there is of course a problem of credit. There is a problem of fiscal imbalance. There is a huge problem of macroeconomic fundamentals. Head to head, compared, India's macroeconomic fundamentals are even worse. Are we saying that India is passing through a crisis? No, we are using the word. India is passing through an economic slowdown. And why is that? Simply because the Goldman Sachs hits India. India is still a part of the BRICS, expected to become the 3rd largest country by 2050. Europe is nowhere expected to be seen by the 2050 notion as far as the Goldman Sachs goes. So the BRICS dream lives on. The question is whether the BRICS dream will become a reality minus Europe. I think that's really taking the dream too far. Now, the bigger question in this whole context is that whether what Europe is experiencing, by itself is a serious issue for any experiment other than the experiment of the Eurozone and for Euro as a currency. Now, to that extent, these are matters which are internal to Europe. I don't think the rest of the world has any business to talk about this, except for being worried about the fact that, again, given its economic size and importance, if the Eurozone sends out signals that it is unable to hold itself together, then there will be volatilities in the foreign exchange market. There will be other hiccups in other places. The euro, despite all the doomsday sales, has still held up as a reserve currency. The dollar continues to struggle as a reserve currency. There has not been any change in the reserve currency baskets of the world. There was a movement to propel an Asian currency unit. In the 2006 ADB annual meeting, it has proceeded nowhere. Asia is nowhere close to coming up with an alternative currency. So let's face it, we will have to live with what we have got. And there is not much that Asia can do in this regard. In fact, if there is a crisis of a geographic, political, and economic entity, then the ASEAN itself is also going through a number of similar crises. Now, when one looks at it from the point of view of India, and how does India actually visualize the crisis in Europe, again to use the word crisis very loosely, I think Ashok very correctly mentioned the micro nuances from the point of business. Now, I think India would make a fundamental mistake. I don't know whether Indians are already making this mistake. I hope they are not. They would make a fundamental mistake if they think that Europe is down and out. And I don't think they are stupid enough to make that mistake for the simple reason, no country would take a decision on Europe by looking at Europe in totality. They would only look at a few entities in Europe, which is a practical thing to do. No country would say that Asia is gone by looking at Asia in totality. They would look at what's happening to India, China, Singapore, and a few of the other major economies. If these economies are holding up firm, then Asia is holding up firm. And I think to that extent, the concern is essentially with 4 of the big major European players who are part of the G8, and which include Germany, France, UK, Italy. Italy has unfortunately slipped pigs. But the rest of the 3, irrespective of the troubles that they are facing, are not going to go down. Why are they not going to go down? Because of 2 important reasons. First, they have enough resilience. They have enough resilience, they have encountered difficulties before, they will pull through. And secondly, the world will not let them go down. There is enough of backing of the international community to let these 3 economies hold up and prosper. As far as the rest of the countries are concerned, well, if Italy defaults $2 trillion, hardly matters much for a world economy, which is far, far more ahead in size of trillions. Argentina defaulted on its debt payments to the IMF. The IMF is still up and running. Solid, bigger, larger than what it was before. As they say, what are a few trillions between friends? So, from this point of view, it's just clearly very important to take a practical view of the situation in Europe for India and the rest of the countries in Asia, and accept the fact that an economic entity and an economic presence like Europe is something which has not come up instantly and is also not going to vanish instantly. It's there to remain. It might be down on its knees for a while, but that does not mean that it cannot recharge its batteries. Now, this is a situation where the rest of the world, and particularly the emerging markets, have to be a little careful in taking Europe on. Now, one outcome of the way the world is probably not taking Europe very fairly, or not probably appreciating the real virtues of Europe, is the Copenhagen discussion in 2010, where the final draft was hammered out by 5 countries, none of which included a European country. Despite despite Europe having had the history of maximum proactive action on climate change in Kyoto Protocol. Now, this is where the emerging market countries would obviously punch above their weights. This is where they would also make a mistake if they think that future negotiations are going to take the Copenhagen path. It cannot. Somewhere or other, Europe has to come back into scenario, because from India to the US, it is impossible to traverse without crossing the Europe, metaphorically speaking. Now, this is where emerging markets have to accept the fact that EU is a presence in not only all major global forums, but in almost all regional forums as well. Even in the forums that are prominent in Asia, EU is present in most as an observer. So the views count. The problem is that, coming back to Asia, there is a view which is there on Europe, and this is where probably it is important for Europe to take a look at history as well. Let me go back to 1997. Asia has recovered well and firmly from 1997, simply because it has learned from the crisis. It has taken note of the difficulties that is experienced. All the economies are back on the robust track, except one. And no prizes for guessing that, that's Japan. Japan refused to learn the lessons of the crisis. And it made life very easy for China. I'm a great admirer of Chinese economic presence. This is not to say that China stepped into the vacuum created by Japan, but the fact of the matter is that Japan's strategic economic significance in the region has gone down simply because it refused to learn the lessons of the Asian financial crisis. It refused to change its vision on economic issues and refused to become pragmatic. So as a result of which, there is now a view that Europe should not refrain from learning the lessons of this particular difficulty that it is going through. And what does it mean? The first and foremost lesson, they should accept the fact that the world is changing. There's a very big world outside Europe. It's very important for Europe to understand that. And that world has a vision and dynamic of its own in different ways and different parts. They have customs, systems, visions, challenges, and opportunities which are very, very different from the way Europe would look at these issues. And it's important to take stock of that reality. And one of the very important points of that reality is that Europe has to look far more closely, proactively, engagedly at Asia Pacific. There are other countries of the world, major parts, major regions, which have very clearly accepted the Asia Pacific as the locus of all major future economic and strategic activity. Europe will only cause itself harm if it doesn't get into the Asia Pacific in a major and proactive way. And that might lead to prolongation of the downturn, and that might lead to crisis becoming a permanent level for Europe. Thanks.